Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is the DEI podcast, a show by DEI practitioners for DEI practitioners and the organizations that look for them. This season, we're taking on what the DiVerity Consultant Network has identified as some of the most pressing issues in DEI in 2023. I'm your host, as well as DiVerity's community engagement lead, DEI and conflict management practitioner, Enrico E. Manalo. So, to set the context for today, it's often said that the only constant is change, but it might be accurate to add and resistance to change. For all the attention that DEI and social justice, organizational justice, and even economic justice have garnered in recent years, it's the resistance to change that has taken center stage. Why is that, and what can we do about it? To talk about it with me today is Katie McLaughlin. Hello, Katie. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Our pleasure. So, before we jump in with Katie, we do want to ask our audience a question. So, what is one clear indicator that there is resistance to DEI work in your organization? So, I'll leave that up for a little while. And if you feel like commenting, please do. All right, getting right into it. So, Katie, from your perspective, where does resistance to DEI work tend to come from?
There's a lot. There's a lot of places. And especially when we think about resistance, change, our brains want us to simplify things, right? Like we want it to be really clear cut. If you've ever done any kind of mental health work, you might be familiar with something called like all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking. And, that's just one way that we've developed our brains. And so in reality, life and humans are so much more complex, right? And I think anyone who does any kind of self-awareness work is aware that they themselves are complex. And
Yeah.
so where does that resistance come from is just as complex. It's embedded in our past in the workplace. That's something that a lot of people don't think about, is how all of our past experiences in the workplace with leaders, with teams, good, bad, neutral, it all impacts our expectations of what it's going to be like wherever you are now.
Hmm.
And we're very quick to create patterns in our mind. So there's this like neurobiology, psychology component that we all have to be aware of as DEI practitioners, as aware, intentional leaders who want to invest in DEI work. And that's something we really have to be aware of, is that it's not simple, it's complex.
I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the things that's been surprising to me, but then, if I zoom out, then I guess it shouldn't be so surprising. But we're dealing with ever increasing complexity on the one hand, but what I see people reacting, or how I see people reacting, and this goes for me too, is sometimes I just want a simple solution, right? Why can't we just fill in the blank, right? And if we really peel back the layers, it's like, oh, because there's a historical aspect, as you said, because it's multidimensional, because it's happening in real time, because we are changing at the same time. And it's not like we can hit pause and disassemble the thing, clean all the parts, spend our
Mm.
time researching the best solution. Like, if
Yeah,
we could only.
right. Totally. Well, and I think that sometimes it can also feel like we have to have so much like education, like preparation, like you were describing. Being a white person in this space, I know that there's a lot of feelings from, white people of like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, which means that we're not engaging at all. And
Yeah.
that's just not correct either, right?
Hmm.
We all have a responsibility to be engaging in the importance of any kind of DEI work, and we can all be taking tiny steps to ingrain and utilize what I refer to as inclusionary behaviors in our workplace, while we may be waiting for our teams to become more diverse, for while we're waiting for equity policies and processes to be put in place in our organization. We can all be thinking about, at the very basic, is there a space for everyone's voice to be heard in our conversations, in our team meetings, especially when it comes to change, right? Are the changes just happening from an isolated, homogenous group of people and homogenous group of thinkers? Or are we engaging with folks across the organization from a variety of backgrounds, identities, thought processes? All of that is really important, and we can all do that starting today.
Yeah, as I've worked with various clients over the years, I feel like some of what clients are sometimes looking for is, on some level, permission, right?
Mm,
Because it's like, I want to be part of the solution. I definitely don't want to be part of the problem, but I don't know what to do. And because I don't know what to do, I don't know if I'm allowed to do something. And it's like, but we're all already doing something, even if we're doing nothing. That plays
right.
into it as well.
Yes, doing nothing is still an action, right? In my work with clients and in my, former kind of corporate career, action was the most important thing that I was able to really distill down as the missing component within our organizations.
Mm,
And so, whether that started in my career early on as a learning practitioner, it's all about, okay, what are our objectives? What can someone do with this new knowledge, right? And so much of our work in DEI, especially in the kind of, I would say, like the early days of the pandemic and following the murder of George Floyd and all things that happened, publicly after that, uh, there were actions that were taken, but a lot of them were like way up here in the
yeah.
sky, it making statements, working on policies and processes. All of that's good. I don't mean to say it's bad, but at the end of the day, DEI is also, I would say, more importantly, about the everyday experience that people are having, and that's also where the resistance lives, right?
Mm,
The resistance lives in that day to day. Can I trust that this is actually going to be followed? That this is safe? That there is an intentionality here? That there will be support. There's just like so much in the day to day, moment to moment experience that really needs to be focused on now.
Absolutely. And just to highlight this for those watching, right? So many of us are aware that bias is something that gets talked about in DEI circles, DEI work. Well, it's really unfortunate that the very first efforts, DEI efforts recently, were those very high level things, right? That set our expectations. That's anchoring bias at work. And so for many people, what happened is, oh, that's what DEI work is. And somebody else is doing that. That has nothing to do with me. DEI
Right.
work has nothing to do with me.
Yep.
Right.
Right. Or I'm not responsible
Right.
for
It's
DEI
like
work.
an
Yep.
HR thing or whatever, right? So we started to talk about this a little bit, but if we can dive in more deeply, so how is this resistance that we're starting to describe, how is that related to conflict?
I would say it's the core of why we have conflict. That, when we were talking about people and the complexity, there's also this very simple nature of people where we all have wants and
Mm,
needs. We may not know how to articulate them, the diversity and beautifulness of those wants and needs can is where some of the complexity comes in. But we all have wants and needs, and so the when resistance comes up, resistance usually creates conflict. That's one way that conflict gets created. But resistance, conflict, it all comes from a place of unmet needs.
mm,
And, that might be, like I was describing before, of like safety. That also might come from the perspective of the wanting their needs to be heard, seen, uh, spoken about, right? Addressed.
yeah.
That's one place where conflict can come up because we experience this perspective of wanting those needs to be expressed. We think maybe if we're the ones who are presenting that change, presenting, the DEI work, that we have this, oh, this is my intentionality of being someone who is hearing needs, holding space for those needs. And that's our like desire or our want that people will on the other end will feel that and hear that.
Mm,
But the desire and want from the other person or people is to have that expressed in a very specific way. And so when I'm working with my clients, we start to identify what are those things that, first of all, I need, I want, and what are the ways that I'm looking for that from others. And then, okay, so what can I do? Right. So do
mm,
I need to be repeating, uh, you know, the the nature of, hey, I want to make sure that this is a space where everyone can feel the opportunity to be brave. It might not feel safe, but there is a bravery that is, required to speak up, share your, true perspective. And I think it's also like you're describing the permission. I want to give everybody listening here the permission to say, I might mess this up. And I acknowledge that. Like, let's just put that on the table. We don't have to be perfect in any of this work,
mm.
especially in conflict. We get better at it by continuing to, well, first of all, let's rehearse, let's practice for some of the likely conflict scenarios. But then when we're in the moment, all you can do is really experiment, rely on your practice, rely on training that you've gone through, and then meet people where they are at and respond to what is happening on the other side, not what is happening just in your mind.
Absolutely. And I think that this is really important to highlight this piece about not getting things just so or perfect, right? So what happens when we know how to do something really well is we can go on autopilot. And actually, that's when really terrible accidents happens, right? So maybe some of you out there have heard that statistic where it's like, I forget, like some very high percentage of auto accidents happen not too far away from home. And it's when
I think
people
it's
are
within
kind
a
of
mile.
within a mile, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like because you think you know it so well, you don't have to actually engage in it anymore. But conflict is all about engaging and being in it, right? And that means the situation could be very different from your mental models and like how you learned to do it, which is why like negotiation is a huge part of conflict and like,
Mm,
this self-reflection piece, like, oh, what am I doing? How am I playing into this? And I think that's it's not easy to always practice engaging in conflict. So one of the recommendations that I make is like, well, especially now that things are opening up again, I think it'll be a little bit easier. But like, let's say you got a group of friends and you're trying to figure out a place to eat. And these days, many people have dietary restrictions or even just strong preferences. So even just deciding that one place, guess what? You're probably engaging in conflict, like super low level, but
totally.
routinely people are going to find a solution that works for everybody, and it really is that simple. But what's not simple is scaling it up and dealing with your emotions to do that, like when we
Mm,
have to, right? And when it comes to work, I mean, that's our livelihood, so that real threat is there of possible reduction of resources, of status, of
mm.
anything.
Thank you so much for saying that as leaders, as people in the workplace who have an impact on DEI programs, on change, we don't acknowledge enough the very core fear
Mm,
of losing your job
yeah.
and your livelihood, right? If we think about the most extreme example, losing your job means you can't pay your bills, means you might get kicked out of your home. And I know, so I live in Seattle, and especially here, I was, going to a panel with the CEO of one of the regional homelessness organizations, and they were describing how every time they hear of a layoff in this area, especially in tech, that they like tense up and really start to get anxious, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not that far, unfortunately, for a lot of folks, especially as costs continue to rise for just day-to-day living. It's not that far
Right.
off for people to be living in their car or worse.
Yeah.
And, that is one of those empathy and emotional intelligence pieces that we really have to acknowledge, that there are really high stakes for many of us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't start to like hold space for those stakes in our decision making and in the way we introduce things, that's a natural place for resistance to come up, because we go into protection mode,
Yeah.
right? And so like if I were to speak up, many of the DEI work in some of the early stages, like I described before, is about creating space for everyone's input and ideas. And it has not historically been safe for many people, especially of underrepresented identities, to be able to speak up without retribution. And
Yeah.
that retribution is very easily slips into our expectations of someone's ability to do their work, of someone's capacity for being promoted, doing other work, taking on other opportunities. All of that, eats at the fear around the livelihood of, can I really sustain this and, support my family and myself?
Yeah, I think something that also doesn't get talked about too much is what stress does to the body. Like we know that it does have an effect,
Mm.
but it has a real impact on something called allostatic load. And allostatic load is actually something that can shorten your telomeres. So if you've been keeping up with research on aging, that's the thing that makes you age, at a cellular level, right? So we've got this threat of taking your livelihood away, this cascading thing of like status. And then on top of that, if you are a person of color, if you're a woman and a person of color, that just multiplies, right? Which is like, if we're whoever we are out there just kind of thinking like, yeah, this is pretty stressful, like, and not to do the comparison thing where it's like, oh yeah, I don't have it as bad as somebody else, so I shouldn't complain. That's not the point at all. It's just
Mm-mm.
that, look, there are stressors, and if we can be doing things to reduce those stressors, then there's going to be a net positive for everybody.
Right. Well, and getting back to the topic of resistance, especially in change and conflict, that resistance is going to come from, that's resistance is breeding that stress,
Yeah.
right? And so we do need to lower those stakes in order for people to um, engage and not just immediately resist.
Definitely. We do have a couple comments that have come in. So I think this was in response to the not my job stuff, right? So Ashley Bivens, thank you so much for contributing. Says, yes, I hear that all the time. It's not my job. There is a department for that. So it is funny. People say there is a department for that, but nobody seems to know which department that is.
Yep.
We also got
Oh,
Jamie chiming in. Thank you, Jamie. There's only two ways to do this work: imperfectly or not at all. That resonates. I don't know about you, Katie.
oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and I feel like we could just keep going back over that same point. And so I will hold back, but yeah, thank you, Jamie, for reiterating that. I love that juxtaposition, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so let's go to a couple other questions that we got here. So if we're pivoting back to the audience since we're engaging, um, well, I'd like to hear from all of you. When you encounter resistance to change in your organization, how do you handle it? And, this could be very small R resistance, like I don't know, getting people to sign up for something. It could be big resistance, like, hey, we're rolling out this multi-department organization-wide DEI strategy, and we need all hands on deck kind of thing. So I'll leave that up for a moment. If we're able to identify where resistance comes from, how do we navigate conflict that can arise from specifically resistance to DEI work?
Um, I want to reiterate that like that embedded in that question is probably the most important first step, is starting to identify where that resistance comes from. And we don't do enough of that work in preparing for DEI work and preparing to get other people engaged in DEI work. And I say that very intentionally because a lot of the ways that we can prevent resistance and I don't know if we can actually really prevent resistance. Let me change that. But we can lessen the resistance, right? And we can create a space that is it going to address some of those maybe immediate gut reactions that it might be resistance. And so, but we don't think enough about the preparation place. And I would say, especially for DEI work, we don't think enough about the preparation. And so that's where, that's why we're having this conversation, right? That's why you do this podcast. That's why I'll also give a little plug. We'll talk about it more later. But myself and another practitioner, Anastasia Greenmore from Reclaiming Us, we are partnering together on a professional development workshop next month on May 16th, and focusing specifically on that preparation for engaging with the DEI, the resistance, the conflict, so we can boost the success of our work. Because that's the whole point, right? We all want any of this work to be successful. And so we have to start working more on that preparation so we are more ready to face those different things and have tools and actions and, all of that. So I hope that, folks will take a look at that. Feel free to reach out if you have questions. Preparation.
Yeah, preparation is so key to like pretty much everything, like I remember that period of the summer before school starts, when you're getting all your stuff and it's on the horizon, and then the first day of school comes and your teacher's like, oh, all right, everybody pull out your pencils or whatever. And there's always one kid who like, oh my God, I don't have a pencil. And it's like, oh dude, I don't want to be you. But it's like, that happens in so many situations, right? So like if I'm somebody in an organization just trying to get through my day, do my job, and then somebody comes in and says, hey, we need you to be part of this solution that you didn't even know is like the solution to a problem. You're like, well, I don't know what to do,
Right.
And if we don't have empathy for that, if we kind of like look down our noses and like get very moralistic, like that's not gonna help get people ready, right? In fact, they'll probably feel even less prepared. We do have more comments coming in. Thank you, everybody. So responding earlier, John Green says, very true. And that is why leadership is so key for driving to the best outcomes for DEIB. Absolutely. And that's part of their preparation as well, right? So they're leading. They're the people in the front in some sense. We got to make sure that they are well prepared because there's a lot of unexpected things that are about to happen. Casey Atha says, I ask people, what is the cause of the resistance? Remarkable thing about resolving or navigating conflict is sometimes you can just say, what is this about? And that's it, and create some space for people to tell you. It's like, it can be hugely powerful. Thank you, Casey. Ashley's coming in here. Part of it for me is empathy, trying to understand where that resistance / fear is coming from. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've experimented with this, Katie. I'm guessing you have. I know you have a whole big bag of tricks, but perspective is such a huge thing when it comes to conflict, right? Sometimes people use the example of the elephant, right? So somebody who sees the elephant from one angle, like very up close, they only see one part of it. Somebody else in the room sees only another part of it. And, they might argue about what it is, not realizing that they're describing different aspects of the same thing. It happens all the time.
Yeah. Well, and I want to talk about that empathy piece for just a moment, that
Let's do it.
It is I believe the biggest missing skill in our workplaces today, maybe our society, but our workplace today for sure, since that's what we're talking about. And one of the things that a misconception about empathy is that we have to know exactly what somebody's going through in order to have that empathy. And the other side of that, that is another misconception, is that what you said earlier of that my pain is not as bad as their pain. And that's part of why in my work, I use theater as a component for helping us to start to step into that world of empathy and emotional intelligence. First we have to be able to see someone else's interactions or reactions. So someone's resistance to change might look like.
Right.
And if somebody else were to take on that image, right? So, Enrico, I'm going to challenge you to take on that image too.
All right. So arms crossed. I'm kind of tensed up right now. Really kind of looking down my nose. Yeah.
Right. Like for me, I was like squinting my eyes a little bit, kind of like adding that skepticism. I leaned really far back in my chair, and you can shake it off, Enrico. But, in that moment, first of all, you have the opportunity to see what I'm doing, right? So you can start to recognize, see what that might resemble for you. And then when you take it on, you can start to think about very like physically, sense memory wise, where have I felt that before?
Yeah.
And when I've felt that, it doesn't matter where, right? It doesn't matter if it was the same circumstances, but we have felt that same experience. And so we can start to think about how might I get my needs met when I'm feeling that way, right? And can I offer that as a suggestion to the group or the individual who is experiencing that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like so people sometimes hear practitioners talk about how mindfulness exercises can be helpful, but sometimes when we get into that very tense, closed off body language, that can be a place for reflection. Like, hey, why am I super tense right now? Why am I leaning away from people? Why are my arms crossed? Where's this tension coming from? And start to relax that a little bit. Lots of comments today. That's great. So we got John Green again coming in and saying, this is in response to the audience question. I handle resistance to change by working to dive into the reasons for the resistance or barriers first. If there is a space where I can engage with the resistors first, then I welcome that opportunity. Great. If this is an issue that goes beyond my scope, I tend to engage with leadership to help the process. Yeah. So this is great. Thank you, John. I think it's really easy to forget that sometimes when a problem, quote unquote, lands on our plate, our first reaction is, I have to solve it. It's not always up to us to solve it, right? Or even to solve it at all. Sometimes we just have to engage with it, or like, connect people to resources that can help, because I know that there are definitely things that I can't always help on. And sometimes the best thing for me to do is to step back and say, I see this problem. I'm going to help you to the limits of my ability, but I can connect you to somebody who's better equipped than me.
Yes. One of the strategies that I talk about when navigating change, and I would say especially because DEI work is change, right?
Yeah.
Let's make that first abundantly clear that when we deal with change, we need a whole system of support that helps us go through that change. And just like you're describing, having other resources. Also, those resources, I mean, I love that John's talking about leadership because you're absolutely right. Leaders tend to be the people who we respond to based on what they're modeling, as well as they can be the source of greatest trust for many folks. But we can also think about really, peers that are already adopted, already bought in, who might be able to relate to someone more directly. And it's really okay to engage those peers, start to identify, hey, it seems like you're really on board with this. Would you be open to sharing, your perspective and how you've navigated that resistance yourself?
Absolutely. So, something that is maybe not made as apparent as it could be, but often when it comes to resolving conflicts, it's not always that surface level, the official channels kind of thing. There's often a lot of back channeling and even engaging people who are maybe informal leaders within your organization, right? So if you got to speak truth to power, sometimes we got to wonder, is it my voice that they're going to hear as clearly as they need to? Or is there another one that they have a relationship with that could maybe say that truth to them in a way that they could hear it as best as they really need to? Let's go to more comments, right? So I'm sorry, I can't see who this person is, well, the name of this person rather, but what they're saying is the least stressful way for me to address resistance in this space is taking time to understand what is important to the person that is resisting and elevating how DEI will support them and their team. Yeah, absolutely.
Love it.
Great point. Making it strategically personal. I like this phrase, strategically personal. Let's start using this to their own success. Thanks. That's a great comment. John Green again. Empathy at its core is not having the answers, but making yourself open to being present in that moment for someone. Yes. Thank you, John. And thank you for being present with us. Ashley jumping in again, agreeing with John. Yes, the vulnerability to be authentic and not have all the answers. Great. Thank you all so much for these comments.
So great.
So let's move into this a little deeper, right? So you do conflict work professionally. I also do conflict work professionally. Most people on earth are not conflict professionals, right? and that's okay, right? So what are some, like, we've already talked about a couple of practical things that we've just kind of pulled out of our bags here on the fly, but like if you were going to make some recommendations to somebody, like, hey, we know you're going to run into conflict, you're going to have to manage it or try to resolve it. What are some practical steps that people can be taking?
So I want to reiterate a couple of those steps for those folks who are joining us late or just in form of repetition. Repetition helps us retain information.
Yeah.
As I put my like little learning hat on, and I'll take it right off. But so we talked first of all about preparation. And part of that preparation, especially when it comes to conflict, is acknowledging possible sources of conflict. And those sources cannot just come from your own experience, but they can also come from a variety of experiences you already have.
Mhm.
What have people told you? How have they responded to past conflict? Have they shared concerns in the past about things in the workplace? And the other piece that's really underutilized is the engagement survey. We almost always ask questions about what people need and what people want. And we don't use that as kind of, I don't want this to be such a strong word, but as ammunition, fuel maybe for our work to understand people and understand the people in our workplace and what they need. So utilize your tools for preparation around that. Do self-preparation. How are you going to respond when people have resistance? We all have a default response to a variety of kinds of inputs. Some might call it, our response to a trigger. And get more aware of that yourself, and ask yourself, would I choose this response? Is this response the one that I want to use when I'm engaging with folks? And then don't be afraid when conflict happens to slow the conversation down. Take a deep breath, model the fact that it is okay to give something space. It is okay for there to be a little bit of silence. And it's just like a few seconds, the matter of taking a breath, right? Because when we slow the conversation down, it allows our bodies and our brains to start that process of regulation. And that is essential for us to re-engage that kind of rational left brain, prefrontal cortex part of our minds that is essential for navigating and regulating our emotional response.
Yeah, and just to illustrate this, sketch this out a little bit. Often in conflict situations, right, we engage our fight or flight response, right? So what happens there is our adrenaline starts going, our tone starts getting a little bit, maybe pointy, maybe aggressive, could come out different ways. We often start talking faster and our breathing becomes somewhat irregular, right? So if we can regulate our breathing, that can help. And sometimes that does take a moment. And back on that theme of asking permission, you don't have to ask permission, but sometimes you can kind of telegraph what you're doing, right? Just to keep people in the loop with you. Like, you know what, I just need to take a breath for a minute. I'm still in this with you, but I'm feeling certain things right now, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page, right? So something that's always stuck with me in grad school is I had a really fantastic mentor in the mediation program that I took. Her name is Jean Cleary. She operates out of Watertown, Massachusetts. But what she would often say is good pace, good tone. Good pace, good tone, you know? And if you think about the conversations you want to have with people, it feels good, right? Like it's not moving too fast, it's not dragging, you know, it's moving along at the pace that you're both going at. And how's the tone? It's inviting. It keeps you engaged. It keeps you in that conversation. So something to just kind of think about as you're also considering some of those tools that Katie mentioned.
Yeah.
So let's turn back to the audience, right? So, audience, what helpful piece of wisdom would you share about navigating conflict with someone who's just joined your organization, right? And where this question is coming from is we know that different organizations have different cultures, but what we often don't extend the lines to is how conflict is handled, right? So sometimes it's a very avoidant culture, sometimes it's a very engaged culture, sometimes it's a very competitive culture, depending on the type of organization and the roles. So I'll let you all think about that a little bit. We do have a couple other comments coming in. That's great. Jamie Moyer back again. It says, it also helps to share how conflict can be generative. Often folks haven't built up a resilience to conflict and are very conflict averse. Thank you, Jamie. That's absolutely true. Conflict, as I hope it's clear, but let's just be explicit. It's a set of skills. And if you don't practice with it, if you don't prepare, then of course you're not going to be good at it, you know?
Well, and I also want to add that many of us in that regard, like we haven't had great role models who navigate conflict. I would say especially in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
You know, generationally and historically, the way to lead was through command, right? Was also through fear, right? Generating that fear was often a way that you like got people to produce. And the workplace and like our body of skills hasn't necessarily caught up to the fact that that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
At least not now. It might have worked in a factory, but you know, now when we are really seeking that equality, that inclusion, the space to belong, that requires us to level the playing field, lower those stakes, and also to address those power dynamics, you know, that come up. So we need a whole new body of tools to be able to engage in conflict, and this is not a small effort.
No. But yeah, the generative power of conflict is enormous, actually, right? So mostly what we experience is negative or destructive conflict, but we can engage in conflict productively, and often that is where some of our best ideas come from. So if we create spaces for people to be safe enough to do that, then I think we'll really start to see a real change. So moving on into our next question area. So Katie, what are the consequences of not proactively dealing with resistance or conflict when it comes to DEI and more broadly organizational change?
So all of our organizational change efforts, all of our DEI work ultimately have goals, right? They ultimately have outcomes. And first and foremost, we're just not going to realize those outcomes. And it also is a fast track potentially for people to leave your organization.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I have known, I can think of one leader in particular, but I know that this person is not a unicorn. There are a lot of folks like this who, unfortunately, this was a CEO, and they said that, you know, I don't, essentially like everybody is replaceable.
Yeah.
And And that, first of all, that's a really dangerous, problematic perspective. We don't take, when we think about business outcomes as a leader in an organization, we don't take enough, I guess, importance, don't place enough importance on the cost of losing someone. And, that cost is very, very prolific. It's not just the, okay, now I have to go and find somebody new. It's also the cost to the people who didn't leave. They now have to do more work. There's more pressure on them. It causes them to be more likely to be resistant. It's also more likely for them to leave as well. And so, that is one of the biggest things that we can't overlook, is not just we miss our goals, but is that we are causing this ripple effect throughout our organization that continues to reinforce the narrative that you do not matter and your needs and ideas don't matter, and we're doing this anyways. So see you later we don't care if you leave.
Yeah, great points. We had a guest on the show last season named Alicia M. Campbell, head of Culture Shift HR. And what she was talking about was a lot of times people don't really recognize that organizations are, in fact, also communities. And so when somebody is laid off, for example, it's not just that you're swapping out a part or reducing the number of parts. Like, that's a community member, right? That's somebody's friend. That's who somebody would go to eat lunch with. That's perhaps a trusted confidant. And we actually don't know. We don't see a lot of the relationships, the dimensions of the relationships that exist. And so really just hacking and slashing at things, it's like, you don't know what kind of damage that you're going to do to the people that comprise the organization or to how the organization functions, right? They might be serving some vital role that maybe they weren't even being paid for, but because of who they were, actually ended up making something work that maybe couldn't have worked otherwise.
Right. They might also be the only person who knows or has access, to certain things and certain processes that are vital to your business, that you then have to spend that time and energy trying to figure out how to do it. And the other thing to think about when it comes to this retention piece, because there's a lot of other consequences, but this retention piece is really important. We're often losing those people whose ideas and presence are the ones that could proliferate change and could be exemplary of the type of culture you're trying to create through your DEI work. You're more likely to retain the people who are protected by the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it even harder to move out of those entrenched behaviors. And now you have to kind of rely on brand new folks to be able to, be that new voice.
Absolutely. And I mean, so one of the things that I was really interested in grad school and beyond is organizational silence. So to describe that very briefly, sometimes it can take different forms, right? So for example, if somebody enters the organization, they're really excited, they keep putting forth ideas, but nobody's listening to them. After a while, they stop, right? So that's one form. There's another form as well. Multiple other forms. But what can happen is if somebody who is very vocal about change, for example, is quote unquote let go, I'm not a big fan of the euphemism, but if they are fired, if they exit the organization against their will, this does send a clear message. But what it might also do is have a chilling effect. It might tell other people it's not safe to speak up. Therefore, I'm not going to. And the very reason why you hire people into an organization is not just for their skills, but also for their ideas. And if you are, taking away people's ability to safely contribute, well, then that's what you're going to get. So just something to think about. Jamie Moyer is chiming in again. While everyone technically is replaceable, there is a point where you cannot find more workers. Absolutely true. The Great Resignation shows how workers are not going to put up with these exploitative workplaces in this new normal. Any thoughts on that, Katie?
Oh, no, I mean, the thing that the thing that I could imagine if I put my mental self in potentially the shoes of a leader like this who thinks that people are replaceable, they might be looking at the all the layoffs that have been happening and think, oh, well, there's now this pool of people who are looking for jobs. But that doesn't mean that you're going to find the right people for what you're looking for. And that might not mean that they're in the right geolocation, they don't have the background or experience. And so, yeah, it's why not keep the best people instead of trying to go out and find someone new? Um, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Jamie did follow up and say, not to mention the institutional knowledge that is lost. Yes. So, very recently, my parents both retired from the University of New Hampshire. And apparently, what had happened is a whole bunch of consultants had come in and recommended that people approaching retirement age be bought out. So, like, en
Mm.
masse, so many people about my parents' age suddenly left the institution. And, like these are people who have been there for 30 plus years. That is an immense, immense amount of institutional knowledge that is now no longer available to that organization. Right. So it might save you a couple cents on the bottom line, but if we're projecting things out, it's kind of incalculable what that impact is going to be.
Mm.
uh
Yeah,
yep.
I've seen other organizations who have, offered, packages and such for that, like, um, and I wouldn't say it's not just age based, but like tenure based, changes. And I have really mixed feelings about that because of that institutional knowledge that is lost, like you've described. But we also have to consider that there are some folks who should not be there.
Sure.
I had like thinking about the higher ed, I had a professor in college who uh, was really like it was really created a
Yeah.
really hostile environment. And unfortunately, I had to take classes with this person because they were
Yeah.
in my major. And so it is really important that we think about, again, that complexity, right? These decisions are not simple, they're not black and white. And we have to acknowledge that there are benefits to making big decisions like that, but there's a lot of drawbacks potentially.
Absolutely. So if we're being thoughtful about who's in the organization or not, that's one thing. But if it's something like, as we're seeing in some of these layoffs now, it's like last in, first out. Like that's just too blunt an instrument in many
Yep,
cases.
totally.
John Green is chiming in here. We have to work with those new employees to make sure they know that as DEIB representatives, we are available to help them navigate issues that cause them heartburn. We instill confidence in them that they have an advocate that will go as far as we can with them to resolve an issue, make sure they know that they and their skill set is valued, and encourage them to buy into the process of seeking progression and not perfection in an organization. And that we want them to be part of the program. Well, I think we've hit our character limit for that. So if I didn't get it all, John, sorry about that. But in general, yeah, I think that's dead on. Let's see here. We got some people agreeing with you, Katie. So Jamie is saying, absolutely, Katie, if there are many tenured professors who are highly problematic, not to mention leaders who buy into the status quo. Sure.
Mhm.
John back again. Agreed, Katie. In many situations, we shouldn't be having quote unquote stay conversations. We should be having quote go conversations.
Yeah. It's interesting because I just had a friend of mine who was going through a really challenging and I would say toxic, workplace scenario. And this person, what was of an age identity that was different from the rest of the group and had a different background, approached things differently, especially than their leader thought things should be approached. And um, essentially, that leader made it harder and harder for this person to be successful and has basically spent the last 6 months trying to get this person to leave.
Mm,
And in reality, to John's point, let's have a conversation about, hey, I don't know that this is working for you or for us. And we're not necessarily saying that we're going to let you go right now, but let's have a real honest conversation about, is this the place for you? And if it's not, can we, to Jamie's comment a little bit later, can we love them out the door?
Mhm.
Can we not just try to force them, right? Like we kind of come to an agreement that it's okay for this person to maybe take a little time to go do interviews. They don't have to be shy about that. Yeah, it's something we don't practice, and I think it's because we're afraid. We're
Yeah.
afraid of what that reaction, that conflict, that resistance is going to be. And in reality, like, we got to do some things that are uncomfortable in the workplace. That's the only way that we are going to make change.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if we're thinking back to even just the process of growing physically, right? That is an uncomfortable process. I
Yeah.
remember waking up, my knees hurt, my teeth didn't fit together right, but it was necessary, right? And it takes a while, so having some patience is with all that is definitely a good thing. So another thing I'm curious about, Katie, is if we're thinking about so an organization is taking all this to heart, right? Well, what would be maybe like one clear indicator that organizations are headed in the right direction when it comes to addressing resistance or conflict related to DEI work?
The first way to think about that is engagement. Are
Mm.
people even showing up? That's one of the first ways that you can start to realize, like, okay, well, maybe people are open to this change. They're open, to this. And then when they're in the room, are they engaged then? Are they asking questions? Or does it seem like they're thinking about it? Are they offering their perspective? That engagement piece is really a first great indicator, and an ongoing indicator, right? You want those people to be engaging in each successive level of your DEI work, because it should be an ongoing process.
Definitely. And again, this can look like many different things. I remember I did one workshop where the leader of the organization ahead of time let me know that the folks were super tired that day. They had a really difficult
Mm.
week, like exhausted. And so I was worried, right? But for one, they all showed up and they stayed to the end, like mostly cameras off, like not too much actual engagement, but they were in the room and they didn't leave.
Hmm.
So I think sometimes you got to take your wins where you can. And sometimes if it's not, you know, if it doesn't go the way that you planned, that's okay. You just got to
Mm.
kind of try again sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and you know, another way that you can tell if you're being successful is that the resistance changes, right? Does it lessen? Are you seeing individuals who have been resistant to change showing up in a different way, right? It's important that, like, we acknowledge that that resistance is potentially individual, and we might need to measure our success individually.
Absolutely. A couple more comments here. Ashley Bivens back again, responding to John Green. What Ashley says is, I was in a toxic workplace and my manager was actually quite kind and had the quote, go conversation. Is very authentic and opened everything up. It changed everything. Well, I'm glad to
Mm.
hear that even under adverse circumstances that conversation was able to happen.
I mean, honestly, I'm amazed. I read that comment earlier, Ashley, and I think that's incredible. Part of me wants to have like a sidebar conversation with you, Ashley, and find out if it was that particular leader who was contributing to the toxic workplace, or if it was kind of the whole, beyond that. Um, and I ask that because part of my work, while I largely work with organizations to help them make more systemic change in their organization, I also have recognized that there needs to be this space for people who are in these toxic environments, spaces where they're not getting any of the best practices and support that we've talked about today. through this work. And so I call it the Toxic Workplace Support Group. And I'm offering that right now on a monthly basis. It's just kind of a drop in. We use some of this theater work to identify, what's really going on, looking at that self-awareness piece, and, how can I start to get some of my needs met, and maybe even protect myself a little bit in these conversations and engagement going forward. So happy to share that link if anybody is interested in that. I didn't expect it to come up today. So,
oh yeah, please share it.
yeah.
So we've got another comment from Asia Monroe. It's important, though, to be real about why orgs don't, quote, choose love, so to speak. There are some very real and clear reasons for that, sinister though they may be. I think that's unfortunately true. I don't know if you got thoughts on that, Katie.
Oh, I mean, part of me, most of my thoughts are wanting to follow up and find out, what are those real and clear reasons. My initial thought about that is the preservation of power, right? That it is quote unquote safer, for the people in power. And that's not just identity based, right? That's potentially tenure based. That is organizational hierarchy based. That it is safer for them to not go there, right? And not change the environment because that then might threaten them.
Yeah, something that I found fascinating about conflict is even the concept of the apology, right? So I learned that one of the reasons why healthcare organizations were kind of discouraging physicians from apologizing to patients was because their legal counsel was advising them that an apology was an admission of guilt, even though that was found to be like really not the case. But sometimes when people are confronted with that fact, like where they might have to admit that they were wrong, they might feel like that opens them up, that makes them vulnerable in ways that they don't want to be, that they can't handle, right? Or that would be really dangerous to their existence. So I don't know. It's again often hard to kind of figure out what might be going through people's minds.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, our society is really litigious. And so, we are quick to, I'd say, funnel our emotions into like what legal or monetary recourse do we have, to provide ourselves with healing. And I believe that that's really where a lot of these lawsuits, come into play. And it's not just about, did somebody do something wrong? Because maybe they didn't, but it's about, I'm feeling some stuff and I feel like you're responsible. And so I should get compensation for that.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll ask the audience, and the audience for this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. What's one thing from this podcast episode that you'll commit to trying when you encounter resistance to DEI work? And maybe you're already doing things, so I'll modify that slightly. What is one thing from this podcast episode that you'll either commit to or recommit to when trying to encounter resistance? Not when you try to encounter, when you do encounter resistance to DEI work. Any final thoughts here, Katie?
Well, I love that you're asking this question because the way that we integrate changes in our own lives and our own work is by, declaring, hey, I learned this. This is a way that I can start to apply it. And a model that I've often been introduced to for coaching is, what am I going to start? What am I going to continue? And what am I going to stop? And so I really appreciate that you added that component of, there may be some things here that you're like, yeah, great. I'm glad I got a little bit of validation maybe about, I need to keep doing this. And that is a really good action to acknowledge that. And I would also call that a win. And I really want to applaud everybody who is here live today and who's engaged. Thank you so much. But also anybody who is listening, this is a form of engagement. And, this is an action that you should take as a win, that you're dedicating time to this and that you care and want to help make your work more successful.
Well, Katie, it's been an absolute pleasure. If people want to find out what you're up to, where can they head?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. But also, as you'll see on screen if you're watching or look in the show notes, that I've got 2 upcoming workshops. One on May 9th, which is a toxic workplace support group. And then if you want to continue this particular conversation and get even more actionable exercises, frameworks, my workshop on May 16th is a co-facilitated workshop with Anastasia Greenmore from Reclaiming Us. And we're going to focus on boosting success in your DEI initiatives.
Thank you so much once again, Katie. This is Enrico E. Manalo with the DEI's podcast. And, it's just been a pleasure to be here with you all. We hope to see you next month. All right. Thanks all. Bye.